The story of ancient brain surgery begins with a paradox so astonishing that it immediately challenges everything we think we know about the evolution of medicine and human intelligence. For when archaeologists began to unearth skulls from the Stone Age, they found, carved into the very bone, undeniable evidence of complex medical operations performed thousands of years earlier than one would expect. These were not chance fractures. They were not meaningless cracks in ancient bones. They were deliberate and purposeful openings into the skull, carried out with skill and precision by people who, according to everything else we know about their world, had no formal science, no written body of medical knowledge, and no laboratories to test their ideas. And yet, they held in their hands the power to cut open the human head, to reach into the fragile chamber that holds the brain, and to attempt something that, even today, strikes fear into the hearts of the most accomplished surgeons. It is in this strangeness that the documentary begins, because to imagine a human standing over another human thousands of years ago, with primitive stone tools, steadying their hands for an operation on the skull, is to stand face to face with one of the great mysteries of human history. How did they know that a hole made in the head could heal instead of kill? How did they dare to attempt it in a world without antiseptics, anesthetics, or even the simple knowledge of bacteria? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did they try it in the first place? Were they driven by desperation, by spiritual belief, by a desire to heal pain, or even by some deeper understanding of the brain itself? The subject is both unsettling and awe-inspiring, for it reveals a moment when the line between medicine and magic, between courage and desperation, became indistinguishably blurred. The word that modern researchers give to this operation is trepanation, and it appears again and again across sites scattered across the globe. Skulls more than 5,000 years old show neat circular openings, sometimes carefully scraped by hand, other times drilled methodically with patient precision. The very sight of these bones is captivating, because in many of them, the edges of the opening are smooth and reformed. That is, the bone healed. Which can only mean that the patient survived. Again and again, we see the shimmering evidence of lives that went on after the unspeakable risk of allowing their skulls to be opened. And not only did they survive, but in some cases, there is evidence that the same person underwent more than one surgery. Stones, sharpened into blades of obsidian or flint, were used to pierce through the strongest layer nature had given us, the skull, in a procedure that even today requires supreme caution. In the Stone Age, this seemed not only possible, but widespread. The realization of this forces us to rethink the intelligence of early societies. Too often the Stone Age is imagined as a dark, brutal time, where life was nasty and short, where people stumbled through existence with little understanding of the world. But every trepan skull tells a different story. It tells us of communities that observed, experimented, shared knowledge, and perhaps developed an understanding of health and disease in ways we struggle to fully comprehend. The moment a hand held a sharp stone to another's head with the intention of healing, humanity crossed into new territory. It was no longer only about survival through hunting or shelter. It was about healing, about the strange courage of risking the mind to save the body, or risking pain to relieve suffering. Throughout different continents, this practice appeared in both isolated groups and more developed societies. In what is now France, skulls dating back 7,000 years bear the scars of successful trepanation. In South America, particularly among Andean civilizations, trepanation became so sophisticated that later cultures achieved survival rates that rivaled those of European surgeons in the 19th century. In Africa, in Asia, And even in the far-flung islands of the Pacific, the same story repeats. Each region seems to have discovered for itself the power of cutting into the head. This is one of the greatest puzzles of archaeology. Was this a universal intuition born of human observation, or was there some forgotten exchange of knowledge that traveled not through writing, but through the journeys of people across oceans, continents, and ages? When modern scientists study the preserved skulls of the Stone Age, they frequently ask whether the purpose of trepanation was medical or spiritual. The line is thin, perhaps invisible. On one level, the operation could have been a desperate act to relieve pressure from an injury, such as a blow to the head or a fractured skull. In other cases, it might have been an attempt to release whatever unseen evil was believed to cause seizures, madness, or unbearable headaches. And yet, even if their reasoning was framed in spiritual terms, the effect was sometimes successful. The pressure was relieved, and the person lived. How uncanny it is to imagine that a treatment which could be seen as magical ritual might also act in a way that is perfectly logical to modern medical science. It creates the unsettling impression that ancient humans, guided by instinct, intuition, or spiritual belief, stumbled into the realm of neurosurgery thousands of years before history would recognize it. The opening mystery of brain surgery in the Stone Age leaves us both humbled and unsettled. For in every ancient skull with its hand-carved opening, there is the silent testimony of a patient who lay down under the hands of another, trusting or compelled to undergo a procedure that might end their life at any second. And yet they endured, and many survived. The faint marks of bone growth at the edges tell us of healing, of lives resumed, of communities where knowledge was passed from one healer to the next. In those communities lived the world's first neurosurgeons, though they had no names, no recorded reputations, and no textbooks to preserve their techniques. All that remains is the quiet evidence carved into the bones of their patients. To listen to these bones is to hear echoes of questions that we cannot yet answer. How much did they understand about the brain? Did they know that behind the skull was the fragile control center of thought, sensation, and movement? Or did they simply follow patterns of cause and effect, seeing that when a head was injured, opening the skull might give relief? Did they sense, in those moments, that they were reaching into the very seat of what we call consciousness? These questions are not only archaeological mysteries, they are philosophical ones. They ask us to reconsider the nature of knowledge itself. Perhaps knowledge does not always arrive in the form of abstract reasoning or formal science. Perhaps much of it arises from trial, from risk, from the willingness to do something terrifying in the hope of a greater good. And in that, the Stone Age surgeons may not have been so different from today's doctors in operating rooms filled with light and steel. As this mystery unfolds, we begin to feel the paradox at its heart. The Stone Age, the so-called dawn of human society, may have already given rise to one of the most advanced and dangerous procedures known to medicine. The act of breaking into the cranial vault to bring relief is a feat we associate with modern hospitals. Yet it was present thousands of years earlier, happening in caves, in huts, in villages that left no written history, no blueprints for us to follow, only fragments of bone testifying that the impossible was real. And so we confront the haunting theme of this documentary, not just the fact of ancient brain surgery, but the greater and more unanswerable question: how did they know? Archaeology has a way of bringing the past back into focus, not through sweeping monuments or legendary tales, but through the smallest details locked away in the earth. When we imagine the Stone Age, we often conjure up broad images of firelight flickering on cave walls, of hunters pressing through silent forests, of tools chipped patiently from stone. Yet those images, as vivid as they are, barely begin to describe the complexity of life in that distant time. The real revelations come not from stone tools alone, but from the bones of the people themselves, lying in graves and burial sites across the world. Among these bones are skulls, and upon examining them, archaeologists began to see something that shook conventional expectations of primitive life. Time after time, they found skulls deliberately marked by human hands with carefully crafted openings. The first time such a discovery was made, it seemed like an anomaly. Perhaps it was the strange result of violence, or of an accident of natural forces. Yet as more and more of these skulls appeared from regions scattered across the continents, the possibility of accident faded. The holes were often too precise, their placements too deliberate, their forms unmistakably intentional. What clinched the mystery was not merely the existence of the openings, but the evidence of healing that surrounded them. Healing meant survival. It meant that these were not corpses left to die under the weight of violence. These were patients who lived on for months, even years, after their skulls had been breached. Such evidence transforms the perception of Stone Age humans. No longer can we see them only as gatherers struggling to survive in a hostile landscape. Here were people practicing surgery. One of the most remarkable aspects of this is the sheer antiquity of the findings. In Europe, Trepan skulls have been found dating back 7,000 years. In Peru, skulls reveal that trepanation was common among the pre-Columbian civilizations, with archaeological studies showing not only attempts but refinements in technique across generations. In Africa, notably among the earliest human cultures, similar skulls reveal a cross-continental practice. The fact that this form of surgery appears in such diverse places weakens the idea of a single cultural origin. Instead, it suggests a recurring human solution across independent groups, discovered, forgotten, and rediscovered through time, as though the idea itself were embedded within the human instinct to heal. How does one explain such a widespread phenomenon? Was it pure necessity, born out of dire injuries in which desperate measures seemed the only hope? Or was it part of a ritual, performed for reasons that transcended the practical? Both explanations find support within the evidence, and both remain powerfully alive in speculation. When we hold one of these skulls fragile yet somehow defiant against thousands of years, it speaks volumes. Imagine laying it gently in your hands and tilting it toward the light. The edge of the hole, worn smooth and showing signs of bone regrowth, becomes a vivid reminder that behind that skull once lived a person who survived one of the most unimaginable ordeals. They may have walked with their community, continued their daily life, told stories around the fire, carried burdens, or even undergone another operation if illness returned. This is the single most astonishing part of the evidence. A significant percentage of trepanation patients survived what, even now, would be life-threatening. No other physical relic of the Stone Age communicates the calm audacity of our ancestors as strongly as these healed openings in skulls. Their existence is a tangible assertion that medicine, however it was conceived in those societies, was not entirely absent or naive. Hidden within early cultures was an empirical spirit of testing, of learning from results, of applying techniques repeatedly because they seemed to work. This empirical spirit is the seed from which later scientific medicine would grow. For modern researchers, the discovery of skulls bearing these features raises both practical and philosophical questions. What drove the first hand to attempt such a procedure? Why would anyone choose to weaken the protective barrier of the head unless they believed that within it lay the cause of suffering? Some theories suggest that people noticed the link between head injuries and altered states of consciousness. Perhaps they saw that when a blow struck the skull, producing fractures or bleeding, changes in behavior, seizures, or confusion often followed. It may have seemed logical to them that creating an opening could release the source of the affliction. In a world infused with spiritual explanations, this release might have been imagined as allowing spirits to escape, or as opening the body so that healing forces might flow in. But what remains most surprising of all is that, beyond their beliefs, the act itself sometimes performed genuine medical benefit. Legitimate pressure relief in a cranial trauma could avert death. One cannot avoid the conclusion that, on some level, Stone Age surgeons were instinctively responding to real pathology. Preserved ancient brains, which have been found in remarkable states of conservation in a handful of cases, add another layer to the enigma. In bog bodies from northern Europe, for instance, soft tissue has sometimes been so well maintained by chemical processes in the peat that the outlines of the brain are still visible thousands of years later. When examined by scientists, these remains can provide evidence not just of human sacrifice or ritual death, but of cranial injuries and potential surgical interventions. In the frozen altitudes of the Andes, mummified remains occasionally preserve traces as well, hinting at trauma to the head that may have been treated, or at least attempted to be treated, by trepanation. To look upon these brains so delicate, so mysterious, still intact enough to yield secrets after millennia is to be reminded of how thin the veil is between the distant human past and the present moment of examination. One realizes with some wonder that the tissue we call the brain, the very fabric of thought and memory, can sometimes survive in the silence of the earth long enough to whisper its story to us today. In truth, the preserved brains in combination with trepanned skulls become a kind of forensic library for the modern imagination. Each specimen tells part of a story that otherwise would have been completely lost. No records remain, no inscriptions, no writings to describe how or why the operation was done. There are no names of the healers, no remembered voices of the patients who lived and endured the pain. But the skulls and tissues themselves, silent as they are, let us infer success rates, let us measure edges and regrowth, let us reconstruct the actions of hands long vanished. In this way, archaeology unlocks a window across time, revealing not only what was done, but hinting at the thought and motivation behind it. And what stands out even more strikingly is that survival after trepanation was not rare. Studies of skulls suggest success rates surprisingly higher than one might expect. In some collections dated to later pre-Columbian times, survival could be estimated at more than half the patients, in certain groups reaching as high as 70%. For ancient surgeons without antiseptics, without antibiotics, without even formal anatomical knowledge, such figures are astonishing. Compared with mortality rates of surgery in Europe even as late as the Renaissance, these numbers place the Stone Age operations in a startling light. Could it be that the techniques they employed, gradual abrasion rather than sudden cutting, careful scraping away of bone layer by layer with a stone edge, actually reduced the risks of infection and bleeding when contrasted with later methods reliant on crude metal blades? In that sense, the primitive technique held within it a wisdom adapted to circumstances. The very lack of sophisticated tools might have forced a slower, gentler method, one that, paradoxically, encouraged survival. This evidence forces us to relinquish the simplistic belief that progress always moves in a straight upward line. The history here is layered with complexity, for it suggests there were moments in which earlier methods, born of care and caution, outperformed later methods dominated by speed and force. Knowledge is not always cumulative. Sometimes it is cyclical, rediscovered, refined, lost, and found again. And so the trepanned skulls of the Stone Age hint at a medical competence that would seemingly vanish, re-emerge, vanish again, until it took root in the systems of knowledge that modern science would claim as its own. The cultural role of these procedures cannot be ignored, because survival alone does not explain the widespread nature of trepanation. There is compelling evidence that many were performed not only for medical necessity but for spiritual or ritualistic purposes. Across different cultures, the opening of the skull may have been perceived as allowing spiritual pathways, as granting access to the divine, or as removing afflictions tied to possession or curses. The practice did not always emerge in response to visible trauma. Some skulls show no external damage other than the surgical opening. Could these have belonged to individuals chosen as ritual participants, where the procedure itself was part of a spiritual rite, with healing as only one possible outcome among other symbolic goals? Such interpretations, while speculative, offer insight into the entangled nature of belief and medicine in early societies. To judge them separately may impose too modern a view, for in the Stone Age, the healer and the shaman were often the same person, and the divide between science and spirituality may not have existed at all. From another perspective, these skulls may also suggest the earliest stirrings of shared medical knowledge passed through oral tradition. If trepanation proved successful in easing pain or saving lives, would not healers have remembered the effect, taught others, and repeated the technique? This raises the profound possibility that in those dimly lit huts and open fields, the first medical schools may have existed, not in the form of institutions, but in the form of apprenticeship. Watching, repeating, and teaching through gestures and memory, humans may have laid the groundwork for what centuries later would become codified medicine. The preserved record of skulls across such wide geography could be seen not as isolated random experiments, but as the remnants of interconnected traditions, each adapted to local understandings and spiritual frameworks. Yet, astonishing as the evidence is, we must also remember the courage of the patients themselves. To undergo such an ordeal without anesthesia, with sharp stones scraping against bone and nerves aflame with pain, required either immense desperation or an unwavering faith in the healer's powers. It is sobering to imagine the moment of decision, a person racked with pain, struck with seizure, or suffering from the result of blunt trauma, consenting or perhaps being compelled to submit to a practice both terrifying and mysterious. Even as the healer lifted their tools, there must have been silence, fear, chanting, perhaps ritual song or incense. The pain endured was unimaginable, yet out of it sometimes came relief and even survival. This aspect gives the story a deeply human quality. The operation was not a cold scientific act, it was always embedded in the emotional fabric of the community, carrying with it dangers, hopes, and perhaps ceremonies of protection. Thousands of years later, as modern researchers gaze upon these ancient skulls, they often describe the experience as haunting. One archaeologist spoke of handling a trepanned skull from a barrow in France, noting that the smooth edges of the bone seemed almost to radiate the story of its maker. Another, encountering skulls in Peru, described the moment of realization that the surgeries had very high success rates, far greater than those of European armies in centuries past. How humbling it must be, to hold a relic of so-called primitive medicine and to see within it outcomes superior to later practitioners armed with steel and textbooks. Thus, every excavation site has carried with it not only historical findings but also philosophical reflections, a quiet reminder that human brilliance finds expression in even the harshest ages. As we continue to explore the evidence, the discoveries accumulate. Skulls with trepanation marks number in the hundreds, even thousands, across continents. Each discovery supports the conclusion: this was no fringe act, no isolated curiosity. It was a widespread practice, persistent over centuries, even millennia. The sheer scale demands explanation. It reflects a deep-seated belief in the head as a central site of both vulnerability and power. For long before anatomical science revealed the detailed functions of the brain, people must have sensed intuitively that the head was different. Strike the arm, and the limb is injured; strike the chest, and breathing is impaired; but strike the head, and the very self can be transformed. Consciousness altered, memory lost, strange behaviors appearing from nowhere. From such observations could easily emerge the intuition that the head contained the essence of a person, and therefore, to open it was to intervene in the most critical seat of human life. This pervasive intuition may be what unites the findings across world regions so separated by geography and culture. Although their specific beliefs may have differed, whether thinking of evil spirits, curses, or physiological necessity, the shared instinct points to a common humanity. Natural observation, coupled with ritual imagination, guided them to the same practice again and again. And in that practice, we see the foreshadowing of later medicine, the boldness to attempt, the persistence to refine, the recognition of patterns in illness and recovery. Above all, we see the courage to act in the face of uncertainty. That courage has always defined human medicine, from the caves to the surgery rooms of today. If there is awe in these discoveries, there is also humility. For the skulls do not speak aloud, they do not reveal all their secrets in neat explanations. Instead, they leave us with mysteries, with questions unanswered. Why did survival rates in places like the Andes seem so high? Did healers there use herbs or ointments to reduce infection? Did they have ritual sanitation methods that inadvertently offered real protection? Did they understand cranial pressure in ways that remain speculative today? These questions linger, reminding us that science cannot always reconstruct the full picture. Some pieces will never be known. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the enigma is part of the resonance of these discoveries, that in them, we confront not only the skill of the past but the limits of our own comprehension. As the bones are lifted from the ground and placed carefully into the hands of scientists, a deep silence seems to accompany them. That silence is not emptiness, it is density. It carries the weight of lives lived, of pain endured, of hope extended through the hand of a healer. It is the silence of survival, echoing forward in time. For those who lived on after trepanation carried their scars not only on their skulls but in the trust they had placed in their community and its knowledge. And those scars, centuries later, remind us of a forgotten chapter of humanity, one in which the line between illness and relief was negotiated with stone tools, intuition, and extraordinary bravery. It is into this silence that we lean, hoping to piece together a story from fragments, hoping to glimpse the intelligence of a distant world. The preserved skulls, the occasional preserved brains, the scattered echoes of practice across continents all come together to speak of a humanity more complex than the simple word primitive can ever describe. To lie down at night and imagine the world of those first surgeons is to feel a communion with lives unimaginably distant yet intimately connected to us. For the same hunger to understand, the same courage to risk, the same urgency to heal runs in our blood still. And from this point forward, as we follow the mystery of ancient brain surgery more deeply, it becomes not only a story of what they did, but also a story of who we are. To look deeper into the puzzle of ancient brain surgery is to find ourselves drawn into the quiet drama of preservation, that strange and improbable process in which the most fragile tissues of the human body, against all odds, survive the collapse of centuries. Most parts of the body decompose quickly. Muscle, organs, and skin dissolve into the soil long before the memory of the individual fades from living minds. Yet now and then, the earth intervenes with chemical sympathy. Certain environments hold on to matter as if protecting it for a day when it will be rediscovered. In these rare circumstances, not only do the bones remain, but the very brain itself, soft and delicate, endures. To see a preserved brain from the distant past is one of the most haunting experiences available to science. It is like peering over the shoulder of time itself, finding that what should have been erased has somehow waited for our gaze. And in such preserved brains lies perhaps the most direct testimony of what ancient surgery encountered: not just the walls of the skull, but the very organ that surgery sought to touch. The mysteries begin in the peat bogs of northern Europe, where conditions of acidity, cold, and oxygen deprivation combine into a preservative solution. Bodies cast into these bogs, whether ritually sacrificed or accidentally drowned, often emerge thousands of years later with skin still intact, hair still framing the skull, and in some rare cases, traces of the brain still present. The sight is eerie, for it looks less like an ancient corpse and more like a sleeping figure whose breath has just barely gone quiet. The brain, when it remains, resembles a pale shadow of its former self, shrunk, altered, yet undeniably there. Forensic studies of such remains have offered glimpses into past lives that bones alone cannot communicate. We begin to see the marks of trauma, the traces of blows to the head, signs of pressure, or cuts that may correspond with surgical attempts. For those who performed trepanation in the Stone Age, these were the realities they confronted. Pain and injury were not abstractions but visible, tangible crises presented by the body of one of their own. In the frozen reaches of the Andean mountains, preservation takes another form. Mummification, whether deliberate or natural, has allowed certain bodies to endure for centuries in the thin, oxygen-starved air. Wrapped in cloth, dried by wind and sun, these mummies sometimes protect their internal organs in astonishing detail. In a few cases, the brain tissue remains, shrunken but preserved enough for scientific inspection. This opens a possibility denied by bone alone: the possibility of studying the interior of the head, where surgery mattered most. Here, patterns of bleeding, swelling, or trauma can be seen, and correlations to trepanation attempts made. When one finds a skull with a carefully carved opening, and within it traces of healing or evidence of diminished injury, the story takes on sharper force. It no longer belongs only to theory, it becomes a visible chain of cause and effect. The Nile Valley, cradle of civilizations, also occasionally yields preserved bodies in which traces of the brain survive. In Egypt, while most mummification rituals removed the brain entirely, sometimes even dissolving it with instruments, there are exceptions. In certain desert burials where natural conditions slowed decay, faint outlines of cerebral tissue can remain. These remains, more than 4,000 years old, speak not merely of ritual but of anatomy. They remind us that early societies were capable of encountering the very material of the brain, even if they interpreted it differently than modern neuroscience would. It is possible that observing the brain, handling it in preservation or ritual, contributed subconsciously to the notion that the head contained unique powers, worthy of both reverence and intervention. The discovery of preserved brain tissue offers an extraordinary scientific opportunity, yet it also deepens the enigma of ancient surgery. By analyzing samples under microscopes, modern researchers can identify disease, trauma, and infection. They can sometimes see whether a blow was delivered before or after death, whether hemorrhaging occurred, whether there were signs of recovery. Each fragment of tissue brings us closer to imagining the conditions faced by Stone Age societies. And in some cases, it strengthens the possibility that trepanation was not merely symbolic but targeted, addressing symptoms of specific cranial injuries. If a preserved brain shows swelling beneath an ancient bone opening, then suddenly the operation seems nothing less than diagnostic, purposeful, shockingly logical within its context. Still, it is the sheer human poignancy that commands attention. For when we picture those ancient healers at work, we must also picture the patient, alive and breathing, their skull perhaps splitting with pain, their community gathered in apprehension. The preserved tissue reminds us that we are not only studying bones, we are studying living stories frozen in time. That brain tissue, once the seat of a person's thoughts, emotions, and memories, once the source of their voice and desires, becomes a quiet ambassador across history. Even the detail of brain folds and patterns, when still faintly visible, tells us these were people just like us, held together by the same fragile matter, wounded by the same accidents of life, and attended to with the same concern. The preservation also provides a rare window into the continuity of trepanation as a medical and ritual tool. In some South American mummies, the evidence of repeated surgical openings stands beside preserved hair, skin, and in rare cases the brain itself. The combination underscores resilience. Here is a person whose body bears not just one scar of surgery but multiple. Survival was not occasional luck, it was a repeated possibility. When placed alongside preserved tissue, the narrative accumulates detail and weight. We no longer see trepanation as an odd curiosity performed blindly. We see instead a craft that, in some societies, was continually refined, as if knowledge itself were being passed down through generations of practitioners. From another perspective, the very existence of preserved brains in archaeological sites infuses trepanation with a symbolic resonance. The brain, which ancient societies did not fully understand, appears in the ground thousands of years later as testimony, almost as if to echo back into the present the hidden knowledge of its time. When researchers open a peat bog body or unwrap a high-altitude mummy, and find remnants of brain staring back, it is easy to wonder whether human history is offering us symbols as much as data. The story of trepanation is already one of courage and mystery, and the fact that the brain itself sometimes survived adds another layer to the poetic enigma. But beyond mystery, there is also technique. The evidence of surgical practice must be paired with practical reality. The tools of the Stone Age, as primitive as they may seem to modern eyes, were sharper than one might imagine. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used in certain regions, can be sharpened to an edge finer than modern surgical steel. Under microscopes, the edge of obsidian retains a nanoscopic sharpness capable of slicing tissue cleanly. When such tools are combined with skillful patience, the act of scraping or cutting into the skull becomes not crudely violent, but calculated and precise. The healer would scrape layer by layer, halting at each moment to care for bleeding, perhaps using herbal poultices to stem infection, until finally reaching the inner cavity. In some regions, circular cuts were achieved by drilling motions, slowly carving a hole. In others, rectangular or angular incisions were noted in archaeological findings. Each variation points to localized techniques, each adapted to cultural traditions, resources, and empirical experience. The question remains, how did they endure the pain? No anesthetic was known, at least none in the modern sense. Yet we cannot underestimate the analgesic power of plants and herbs, many of which have strong sedative and numbing qualities. Across the world, indigenous communities discovered natural sources of relief, leaves that dulled sensation, roots that calmed the nervous system, fermentation processes that created intoxicating effects. It is not impossible that Stone Age surgeons employed these resources, whether consciously medicinal or framed within ritual. Combined with chanting, rhythm, and the strong psychological framework of ceremony, patients may have been placed into trance-like states. Such states, though different from medical anesthesia, might have reduced terror and endured pain. The archaeological record cannot confirm this directly, but ethnographic parallels encourage imagination. As one follows the threads of discovery, it becomes clear that trepanation was never a trivial act. Nobody would choose to cut into the skull lightly. Its very presence across cultures asserts significance. It occupies a space at the intersection of survival and meaning, between healer and mystic, between evidence of trauma and the hope of recovery. And when preserved brains are placed beside preserved skulls, what emerges is an intensely human portrait of communities grappling with forces larger than themselves. Sickness, injury, sudden collapse all demanded response. To respond with ritual was natural, and to respond with surgery was astonishing. Yet somehow the two became one, with ritual and surgery indistinguishable, forming the great mystery of early medicine. The image of preserved remains haunts the imagination not because they are remnants of death, but because they are persistent witnesses of life. Every fold of preserved brain, every hardened edge of carved skull, every trace of healing bone, whispers that human beings, even in times we label primitive, refuse to submit quietly to the ravages of injury or disease. They fought against it, using the tools and beliefs at their disposal. They experimented without textbooks, they refined without formal systems, they risked with courage born of communal faith. The result is a legacy so profound that its echoes still unsettle modern science. For modern neurosurgeons, whose daily practices are enshrined in antiseptic rooms with shining instruments, the comparison to Stone Age operations is both stunning and humbling. Some have admitted that the skill evidenced in ancient skulls deserves respect, even admiration. It reveals that the commitment to heal is not bound by time or technology. It is woven into the human spirit. The preserved brains and trepanned skulls remind us that people of the past were not simply surviving, they were innovating, experimenting, and reaching across mysteries toward the preservation of consciousness itself. Thus, in contemplating these remains, we step into a continuum. The trepanations of the Stone Age, the preserved tissues of bog bodies and mountain mummies, and the scalpels of modern surgery each belong to the same chain of human defiance against mortality. They bind us into conversation with ancestors who dared to open the vault of thought with stone and faith. The preserved ancient brain, delicate and faded, stands as both relic and monument to this defiance. It embodies the paradox of fragility and endurance, whispering that in every age, people have sought to push back against the darkness of suffering. And so, when we listen closely, the preserved remains do not only tell us about ancient medicine. They tell us about ourselves. They tell us that across the sweep of millennia, the desire to heal, to save, to risk life for life, is one of the most constant rhythms of humanity. These brains, these skulls, left to time, emerge now to remind us that wonder and courage are old companions, and that the story of brain surgery did not begin in hospitals, but by the firelight, in some forgotten gathering, where stone met bone and a strange new chapter of human history was opened. When we turn from the preserved evidence of bones and brains to the question of how such operations were actually performed, the mystery deepens further. For it is one thing to recognize that ancient humans cut into the skull, and quite another to imagine the precise movements of their hands, the implements they selected, the preparation of the patient, the control of bleeding, and the closure of such a wound. Every skull bears not only the story of survival but the signature of technique, etched into the bone by tools crafted thousands of years before the reach of metal or science. To study these marks is to watch a silent replay of procedures once carried out under firelight, with crude tools that, paradoxically, were far sharper and subtler than they first appear. These details transform the enigma from a mere curiosity of archaeology into a living drama of intellect, improvisation, and courage. In the Stone Age, the world itself was a workshop. Flint, obsidian, and other stones fractured into sharp edges under skilled hands. Archaeological finds across the globe demonstrate that these tools were not simply for cutting wood or hunting animals, they were shaped into implements of fine delicacy, capable of scraping, drilling, and carving with remarkable precision. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, is especially revealing. When broken or flaked to a perfect edge, it produces a blade more precise than steel, slicing through material with such fineness that even modern scientists sometimes use obsidian scalpels in experimental surgery. Imagine, then, the healer thousands of years ago, holding such an edge in the light of a firestone, yet sharper than our most sophisticated tools. It is not difficult to see how, under patience and skill, such a blade could be applied to human bone. The techniques varied widely, each reflecting both creativity and necessity. One common method was scraping the slow, steady removal of bone by rubbing a sharp edge across the skull's surface until the inner cavity was reached. This was no hasty blow, no crude hacking gesture. It was a process that could take hours, even days, conducted with care to avoid sudden fractures or catastrophic bleeding. The archaeological record supports this. The edges of many trepaned skulls are smooth, even, consistent with controlled abrasion rather than accident. Another method was boring, where repeated drilling motions created small perforations that could then be linked together into a larger opening. Still another was cutting by incision, sometimes in geometric shapes, rectangular, oval, or trapezoidal windows carved methodically into the bone. Each of these approaches implies both intention and experience. They were not attempting the unknown entirely blindly, they had watched, learned, refined, seen results, and returned to the practice with adaptation. The very diversity of the techniques is significant. In Europe, scraping seems to have dominated early attempts, while in the Andes, cutting with sharp tools created nearly straight-edged windows. Such differences suggest that trepanation was not merely an automatic ritual but a procedure developed independently by different groups, each adapting to local tools, needs, and traditions. This diversity also hints at a kind of trial-and-error method that resembles scientific learning. Some methods may have led to lower survival, abandoned over time, while others, more successful, became embedded in communities and passed through generations. What we see in bone is not mere random carving but evidence of cultural knowledge. Alongside technique, we must also imagine context. no operation occurs in a void. The patient would be prepared, whether by ritual, medicine, or both. Ethnographic parallels with more recent traditional societies suggest that herbs, smoke, or intoxicants may have been used to dull pain or induce altered states of consciousness. Ground-up leaves of narcotic plants, fermented drinks, or ritual inhalations could have supported the endurance of the patient. In some regions, pressure points or herbal poultices may have been applied to control bleeding. Admittedly, direct evidence for these practices does not survive, but plants with such properties were known to many traditional societies, and it is not implausible to believe Stone Age healers employed them instinctively. It was not purely violence without preparation, it was care cloaked in the means available. Bleeding would have been the greatest danger. The scalp is richly vascular, flowing quickly under the cut of a blade. Yet even here, early techniques may have assisted more than they hindered. The scraping method, for instance, removed bone gradually, avoiding sudden trauma to blood vessels. Herbal compresses may have assisted clotting. Cold application, snow, cold water, or cooled stones might have been used to constrict swollen vessels. The gradual approach suggests a sensitivity to the problem, an awareness that patience was not only wise but necessary. When modern fields of surgery emphasize delicacy and control, we can glimpse a shade of that principle already alive in the distant past. Pain, of course, was omnipresent. Without anesthesia, the agony must have been excruciating. But here again, human beings reveal strange depths of resilience. Across the world, in many traditional operations recorded in recent centuries, patients have endured unimaginable procedures while sustained by trance, chanting, or communal presence. The rituals surrounding trepanation may not only have had spiritual meaning but psychological support. The sound of drums, the presence of kin, the repetition of incantations all could ease terror, sustain courage, and create the altered state necessary for survival. In this light, ritual was also medicine, indistinguishable from the operation itself. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Many trepanned skulls show not a single hole but multiple, sometimes done at different times in life. Some individuals endured 2, 3, even 4 operations over time. The bone healed between them, meaning not only did they survive but returned for further attempts. This strongly suggests that both healer and patient saw value in the procedure, whether for relief of headaches, seizures, or spiritual afflictions. It was not a one-time experiment doomed by fatality, but a recurring practice embedded in human tradition. This recurrence is perhaps the most powerful proof that the operation worked either in medical outcome, perceived psychological improvement, or both. We can also trace the hand of the surgeon in the very shape of the hole. Some have edges that taper delicately inward, showing controlled manipulation of depth. Others reveal accidental slips, scraping too deeply, or uneven cuts betraying hesitation. But the fact that so many patients healed implies that, in time, experience reduced error. There is evidence even of pseudo-trepanation, where scraping was carried out into the skull's surface without breaking entirely through. Perhaps this was performed as a symbolic act, to avoid the dangers while performing the ritual. This reveals a consciousness of risk, an awareness that working too far could kill, and the attempt to preserve the meaning without execution of its full extent. In other words, trepanation was not one uniform act, but a spectrum ranging from symbolic surface rituals to full cranial penetration. Such variation speaks eloquently of a practice embedded in culture and medical knowledge alike. One cannot separate these techniques from the broader web of Stone Age life. Picture the scene: a hut or open clearing by fire, the patient seated or restrained, the healer surrounded by instruments, carefully knapped stone blades, animal bones used as levers or scrapers, pieces of obsidian glittering with minimalist perfection. Around them perhaps are people chanting or watching silently, holding their breath at every scrape. The healer leans close, sweat falling, working not with textbooks but with tradition. Time passes differently in the moment of operation. Each scrape of stone against bone is both terrifying and intimate, carrying within it the hope that relief will follow. And when, against all odds, the patient survives, breathes again, and later continues life, the entire community must have seen not only the healer's courage but the vindication of the ritual. Survival itself was proof of power, and power became knowledge, passed to the next generation. For us today, one of the most staggering realizations is how high the survival rate was compared to expectations. As mentioned earlier, in certain cultures, the rate was superior even to European battlefield surgery in the 18th century. The reason lies not only in careful technique but perhaps also in simplicity. Whereas metal instruments, reused without sterilization, spread infection rapidly in later centuries, the Stone Age surgeon relied upon cleanly broken stone edges, sharper and in some ways more sterile at the moment of creation than dull metal blades. Fire may have been used to heat instruments before use, whether for ritual sanctification or practical cleansing, unintentionally serving as sterilization. Herbs with antibacterial properties may have been applied to wounds, not because microbial theory was understood, but because plants known to reduce swelling or prevent rot were part of natural knowledge. Thus, what appears primitive might in fact have been, in several respects, safer. It is also important to note that trepanation was not restricted to adults. Children's skulls occasionally show such operations too. This raises further fascination. Children, more vulnerable and fragile, suggest that families were willing to apply these treatments even to their youngest, that they believed in the power of the procedure enough to risk it. This detail gestures once again toward a cultural framework surrounding the operation, a belief so integrated that it was not optional, but deemed necessary for healing or spiritual balancing. It was not only the strong who endured it, but sometimes the very vulnerable, further proving that this was not mindless brutality but a codified practice. The physical legacy of technique is written in the bone with stunning clarity. Some skulls show intervention directly over fractures, suggesting pragmatic response to injury. Others appear free of trauma, pointing instead to ritual or neurological complaint. Yet all share the detail of cut, scrape, or bore, marks that carry the ghost of a hand once alive. To follow the ridges of these cuts with a finger today is to touch across time not only the wound of the patient but the act of the healer. Within each line lies intention, persistence, and the indomitable will to attempt the impossible. This world of technique forces us to abandon the old stereotypes of the Stone Age as mere brute survival. Instead, it demands acknowledgement of sophisticated observation, tool mastery, and community trust. These people were not fumbling blindly in darkness. They were, in their own context, pioneers of a frontier both physical and metaphysical. Their tools, though made of stone, were guided by intelligence. Their methods, though born of necessity, were honed with adaptation. Their results, though imperfect, were profound enough to ripple across centuries as testimony. And when we look at those cuts in bone today, we are not merely cataloguing oddities. We are, in essence, reading the first pages of a surgical textbook written without words, transcribed instead in the living evidence of human skulls. The paradox reignites: how could they know? Even if driven by ritual, the consistent evidence of survival reveals something deeper than chance. They knew with their hands, with their eyes, with their courage. They knew by trial, by failure, by the stories of those who lived and those who did not. They knew instinctively, even without theories. And perhaps this is the most profound truth of all: knowledge need not always arrive clothed in science. Sometimes it arises in raw form, through the dialogue between body and healer, between pain and relief, between risk and hope. The Stone Age healer, scraping bone with obsidian, was not so far in spirit from the neurosurgeon in a sterile operating theatre. Both are bound by the same determination to reach into the seat of suffering, to endure the risks, and to hold in their hands the fragile line between death and survival. And so the study of techniques does more than inform archaeology. It reminds us of the indissoluble continuity of courage, intellect, and human resilience. When we linger over the marks left by a Stone Age blade, we are bearing witness to an experiment repeated countless times, an experiment no less audacious for being born in an age of caves and fire. We are drawn closer to those healers and their patients, not as distant others but as reflections of ourselves. For even today, when technology is unmatched and knowledge vast, the essential human act remains the same: to dare to open a life in order to save it. That daring, illuminated by fire on stone, is one of the earliest and most enduring chapters in the story of who we are. To follow the trail of trepanation further is to enter into the question that has startled physicians and historians alike: how often did these patients survive, and what can survival teach us about the skill and knowledge embedded in communities that lived thousands of years ago? For it is one thing to recognize that procedures were attempted, but quite another to confront the reality that many, perhaps even most, of these operations were not fatal. This is not speculation, it is written in the bones themselves, observable in the microscopic regrowth along the margins of ancient skull openings. Bone, unlike other tissues, tells a story of healing that is visible across millennia. When the edges of an opening become rounded, smoothed, or thickened by new bone growth, it means one thing only: the patient lived. And where healing is extensive, where the scar tissue of bone is strong, survival was not merely a matter of days, but of years. The first time archaeologists noticed this pattern, the implications were almost too astonishing to believe. Conservative estimates suggest that in some societies, survival rates exceeded 50%. This was not a fluke. In certain pre-Columbian Andean societies, where trepanation became systematized, the survival rate may indeed have been closer to 70 or 80%. This is remarkable when one remembers that until the 19th century, surgery conducted in the most advanced European cities often killed more patients than it saved. The major cause was infection, spread rampantly through the absence of antiseptic technique and the reuse of contaminated instruments. Yet Stone Age surgeries, executed with obsidian or flint, often avoided this fate. The tools may have been rudimentary in material, but when freshly broken and shaped, they were sharper and in some respects cleaner than the dull iron blades of later centuries. Some modern experiments have confirmed that when obsidian blades are examined under high magnification, their edges are almost molecularly smooth, producing a cut so fine that tissue trauma is minimized. Without intending, ancient surgeons had at hand some of the most effective cutting tools nature could provide. Archaeologists and medical historians also note another factor likely contributing to survival: Technique. The scraping method used in many early trepanations produced a slow, careful removal of bone, generating less catastrophic bleeding. Instead of a sudden fracture or violent penetration, the bone was thinned gradually until an opening was possible. This method, although painstaking, allowed constant adjustment and minimized risk. In comparison, quick sawing or chiseling, characteristic of later unskilled attempts, often increased danger. Thus, the primitive technique may in fact have been safer. What is striking is not only that individuals survived, but that entire communities seem to have preserved and refined the procedure across time. This suggests a cultural consensus: if enough patients had routinely died, the practice would have vanished. Human societies rarely persist in repeating what is only destructive. The very endurance of trepanation through centuries is a testimony that it was seen as worthwhile, as yielding results, as providing relief or cure strong enough to balance its risks. This cultural persistence is perhaps as powerful an argument for effectiveness as the physical survival patterns in skulls themselves. Looking closer, one can divide survival into categories. Some openings show early signs of healing, indicating survival of days to weeks. Others show extensive remodeling, where bone edges grew smooth and thick, restoring structural strength, outcomes that require years of life after the surgery. The strongest indicator is when multiple trepanations are found on the same skull, performed at different times in life. Such individuals must have lived long enough to endure not one but several operations, a chilling but also inspiring reminder of both resilience and trust in their healers. Even today, the idea of undergoing brain surgery more than once fills most people with dread. That it was done in Stone Age societies forces us to reconsider the courage and cultural frameworks of the past. To understand success rates, one must also consider context. In the Andes, where skull evidence is numerous, researchers estimate that survival during the Inca and pre-Inca periods exceeded that of later European battlefield surgeons. In one study, out of several hundred skulls found, a majority revealed healing. European military hospitals in the 18th century, using the most advanced methods of their time, reported mortality rates of 70% or higher in cranial surgeries. The comparison is staggering: primitive methods surpassed modern ones. This does not mean that Stone Age surgeons understood bacteria or infection, but perhaps local practices and natural environments reduce certain risks. Herbal poultices may have contained antibacterial agents. The use of fire or sun to sterilize instruments or wounds, even if thought of as ritual, may have had practical effect. The outdoor settings in which procedures took place may have reduced the dense bacterial loads common in filthy urban hospitals centuries later. By accident or by wisdom, survival was not only possible but common. Yet we cannot romanticize without caution. Trepanation, even when successful, left scars not only on bone but on lives. Patients who survived might have experienced lasting disabilities, weakness, seizures, pain, but they also might have experienced genuine relief. Some skulls show injury from trauma, where trepanation likely reduced pressure from fractures. In these cases, surgery may have been life-saving. Others, where no trauma is visible, are more mysterious. Perhaps these patients sought cure from headaches, vertigo, or epilepsy. In some cases, the operation could have released cranial pressure or removed fragments, producing real benefit. In others, maybe relief was less physiological and more psychological or spiritual, the reassurance of having engaged in a healing ritual that reaffirmed the patient's place in a supportive community. Both forms of outcome, physical and psychological, would have contributed to the persistence of trepanation as a practice. The concept of survival also extends beyond biology to cultural survival. Each successful recovery became a powerful story within a community. Imagine the tale repeated by villagers: a man struck on the head, writhing in pain, brought to the healer who cut open his skull, and who against expectation lived, breathing again, walking again, rejoining the world. Such stories would magnify the reputation of the healer, fortify confidence in the practice, and inspire others to risk the procedure in times of dire need. Every scar on a skull was thus also a landmark in social memory, anchoring the continuity of tradition. The evidence of survival changes the way we interpret people of the distant past. It is easy to dismiss them as brutal, superstitious, and reckless, imagining that they cut into heads without care. But survival en masse is proof of care, proof of observation, proof of refinement. One does not stumble upon repeated success by accident. It requires patience, trial, communication, and the humility to learn. We cannot assume that Stone Age medicine was uniform; rather, it was diverse, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, continually adapting. What matters most is that it did succeed often enough to become embedded in humanity's long history. Indeed, the conceptual leap is enormous. The head is the most sacred part of the body in nearly all societies. To risk cutting into it requires immense trust, immense courage, even a suspension of ordinary fear. That entire communities accepted and refined trepanation testifies not only to medical ingenuity but to cultural frameworks that permitted such daring. If survival had been rare, communities would have turned instead to other rituals. The survival rates we see in bone reveal that in many places trepanation was trusted precisely because it had proven itself. There is another layer to this evidence: comparison across time. In the earliest instances some 7,000 years ago, success is visible, but not as striking as in later centuries. Early skulls sometimes show partial healing, indicating attempts where patients lived only briefly before succumbing. But centuries later, in Peru and Bolivia, techniques improved, healing was more extensive, and survival soared. This suggests a slow accumulation of knowledge. Not only was trepanation attempted, but over generations the methods were improved, refined, standardized. Stone tools gave way to metal in some regions, geometric incisions became more regular, and outcomes improved. In this trajectory, we see not random superstition but the long arc of empirical adaptation. To listen to the testimony of healed skulls is to be reminded that human curiosity and determination often overcome limits thought insurmountable. Even without germ theory, antiseptic chemicals, or anesthesia, people survived. How? Likely through a constellation of factors: sharper and cleaner tools than commonly imagined, cautious, gradual technique, plant-based treatments that unintentionally worked against infection, open-air surgical environments, and the immense resilience of the human body when supported by cultural belief. In that tapestry of factors lies the profound truth: survival was not impossible, it was real, and it was common enough to shape medical history. The magnitude of this fact cannot be overstated. We often define progress by the supposed superiority of the present over the past. But here is an example, carved into bone, where the past outshines the present across centuries. For centuries, so-called civilized medicine lagged behind what was accomplished by forgotten healers with stone tools. The paradox humbles modern pride. It forces us to accept that wisdom can exist without writing, that knowledge can flourish outside formal science, that empirical truths can be carried in oral tradition and ritual no less powerfully than in laboratories. One might say survival is the ultimate measure of success. These skulls, bearing both scars and growth, are monuments not of death but of endurance. They declare that our ancestors, far from helpless, fought against injury with ingenuity that saved lives. Each rounded edge of bone healing is a silent monument to survival. Each patient who lived after trepanation carried forward not only their own life but also the proof that healing was possible. This proof multiplied, spreading the practice across continents and centuries. So as we gaze into museum cases where skulls from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas now rest, we are not staring at relics of arbitrary violence. We are looking at a medical archive. The bone has become a living textbook, each healed wound a page of clinical record. From these pages, one enduring lesson emerges: ancient humans, even in the era we label Stone Age, possessed both the practical skills and the courage to achieve what we once thought impossible. They dared to open the head, and more often than not, the patient lived. That fact alone reshapes our understanding of the human journey. And in the soft glow of such realization, it becomes clear that the survival of trepanation patients was more than a technical triumph. It was a cultural one, a spiritual one, even a philosophical one. It meant that communities were willing to risk novel solutions, to trust their healers, to endure agony for the chance of life. It meant that people could look suffering in the face and respond not with despair, but with intervention. In this, the Stone Age appears not primitive but profoundly human, bold, caring, inventive, fragile, and astonishingly resilient. When all is said and done, the healed skulls discovered across the world do not simply catalogue medical history. They remind us what has defined our species from the beginning: the refusal to accept suffering without resistance. Even when survival seemed nearly impossible, the attempt was made, and life found a way to endure. This spirit, that will to live, to try, to intervene even when knowledge was incomplete, remains the lifeblood of medicine today. In this truth lies the heartbeat not only of trepanation, but of humanity itself. Why, then, did they perform such operations in the first place? After all, human beings, even at their most courageous, do not typically take the risk of cutting into the skull without motive. Each act must have been inspired by a blend of necessity, observation, belief, and ritual. This is perhaps the most enticing and enigmatic part of the story, for here we step not only into bones and scars but into the intangible world of thought, the assumptions and convictions that motivated those ancient healers to dare. In asking why this was done, we glimpse into the heart of cultures where medicine and meaning were intertwined so completely that to separate them now risks misunderstanding. The answer is layered, like the earth that buried these skulls, and in peeling the layers, we find both familiarity and strangeness. One of the simplest explanations ties trepanation directly to physical trauma. Skulls uncovered with both fractures and openings suggest pragmatic reasoning. A man suffers a blow in conflict or accident, swelling and pressure build inside the cranium, and the healer decides to act. Anyone with sufficient observation could see that swelling and bleeding from other injuries needed relief. Perhaps they deduced that the skull was no exception. Just as pus or pressure could be released from wounds of the limb, so maybe the head could be opened to release pressure. In this sense, trepanation can be seen as a remarkably logical extension of wound care. Brain swelling, hematomas, and fractures are dangerous even today, often requiring surgical relief. That Stone Age communities reached this conclusion through direct observation is not only plausible but entirely consistent with their survival-oriented mindset. They were nothing if not observant of nature and the body, for their very survival depended on such observation. Another explanation, equally logical in its own context, is the treatment of chronic illness. Conditions such as epilepsy, migraines, or unexplained fainting would have had no visible cause to Stone Age societies. Yet the link to the head may have seemed intuitive. Seizures begin with the body convulsing, but perhaps were believed to emanate from the head, where sudden loss of consciousness could seize the spirit, where strange behaviors seem to emerge. For headaches beyond endurance, or fits interpreted as possession, opening the head might have seemed a way to release the hidden burden. Here, medicine again converges with meaning. In modern terms, we might call it an empirical attempt to intervene in neurological disorders. In theirs, it may have been an effort to set the spirit free from confinement. The motivations were not contradictory. They were unified in the same act. The symbolic explanations run deep. In many cultures, the head was considered the dwelling place of spirits, a vessel of breath and soul. To bore into the skull was not merely to perform surgery, it was to open a portal through which forces might exit or enter. In some trepan skulls where no sign of trauma appears, this interpretation gains strength. The holes are not placed where fractures or injuries existed, but in seemingly arbitrary positions, sometimes symmetrically. Could this have been an attempt to balance spiritual forces, to neutralize curses, or to achieve altered states of perception? Ethnographic parallels abound. In certain tribal traditions recorded as late as the 19th or 20th century, shamans still performed trepanation rituals, arguing that they allowed visions or granted enhanced spiritual awareness. By piercing the barrier of bone, they believed the mind could commune more directly with ancestral or divine realms. Whether the patient survived or not, the act itself was meaningful in spiritual economy. There is also evidence suggesting that trepanation carried ritual purposes within rites of passage. Perhaps certain individuals undergoing the procedure were viewed as marked, chosen, or transformed. To endure such an ordeal and survive would have imbued tremendous status, confirming social identity as one touched by powers greater than ordinary. In a harsh world where survival signaled resilience, the scar of a trepanation may have become a badge of honor, proof of favor by spirits or the community. Healed skulls, then, were living symbols to those around them, embodying courage and mystical significance alike. We must also consider the role of war and human conflict as motivation. Battle, ambush, and interpersonal violence were part of early societies, as evidence of other skeletal injuries attest. Head trauma was common, and with head trauma came swelling, confusion, unconsciousness, even coma. Communities, seeing warriors fall under such conditions, may have developed trepanation as an emergency measure to retrieve valuable members of the group. Imagine the urgency: a fighter struck during conflict lies unresponsive, the group fearing his spirit is trapped. A healer acts, carving away bone in desperate hope of recovery. And if survival occurs, the act becomes legendary, seeding further attempts in the future. Thus, necessity and culture intertwine, reinforcing one another with every life restored. What adds weight to these speculations is the evidence of repeated trepanations in some individuals. Where a skull shows not only one hole but several, performed over years, survival beyond ritual symbolism is undeniable. Some of these were certainly pragmatic treatments of repeated injury or illness. They must have provided relief, or at the very least, convinced healers and patients that relief was possible. This continuity points strongly toward the dual motives of practical medicine and spiritual ritual combined. The healer was simultaneously doctor, priest, and experimenter. And yet, the question of why also leads us to confront the timeless human mystery of suffering. Pain, sickness, unpredictability, these have haunted every age. What defines humanity, perhaps, is not merely the presence of suffering but the refusal to surrender to it. Faced with inexplicable seizures, unbearable headaches, or the loss of consciousness after trauma, Stone Age societies did not only despair. They acted. The action itself was terrifying, risky, but it was action nonetheless. In that sense, trepanation embodies the deepest human response to suffering, an unyielding drive to intervene, to push back, to force life where death threatens. Whether the act was framed as surgery or ritual does not change its essence. It was resistance. If some patients were treated for epilepsy, it reveals a profound observation. It means that ancient societies identified seizures as recurrent, not random, leading them to seek patterns and interventions. In some skulls, evidence of trepanation coincides with features evocative of trauma consistent with falling during episodes, lending credibility to this link. Similarly, chronic headaches or pressure from sinus or cranial disorders could have been interpreted as residing in the head structure itself, prompting relief through bone opening. That such reasoning may have occurred without writing or anatomical science speaks volumes about the experimental intelligence of these societies. The blend of spiritual and medical motives also reminds us that the modern distinction between body and soul, between medicine and ritual, did not exist then. To heal was always also to rebalance spiritual forces. To cut the skull was to open not merely bone but destiny. For us, accustomed to sterile categories, this mingling may seem irrational. Yet from another perspective, it suggests that Stone Age medicine was not compartmentalized but holistic. Every operation was an act of healing, ritual, and courage simultaneously. It was complete, addressing not only the body but the psyche, not only the wound but the meaning of the wound. We can almost reconstruct through imagination the sense of awe surrounding these events. The healer prepares tools, the community gathers, the patient perhaps chants or is subdued by herbs. Incantations are murmured, the sharp flint strikes against bone, the smell of blood rises, and the community waits in anxious silence. If the patient survives, the miracle is proclaimed. If the patient dies, the act still holds meaning, perhaps understood as the spirit being freed. In either case, the act itself reaffirms the power of intervention, the communal willingness to resist and to act. Thus, the why of trepanation must be understood not as a single line of reasoning, but as a tapestry of motives threaded together, pragmatic, spiritual, social, and symbolic. We may never isolate the precise balance of these forces. But the survival of patients across so many cultures demonstrates that medical reasoning, however framed within ritual, did play a decisive role. Otherwise the practice would not have continued, would not have yielded the healed skulls that confront us today. The answer to why is therefore simpler and more complex than expected. They did it because they observed that sometimes it worked. They did it because it resonated with their cosmology. They did it because both body and spirit demanded response. And they did it because, at the heart of the human condition, there resided then as now the refusal to give suffering absolute dominion. The scar of trepanation must have carried further meanings beyond the individual. In life, the healed patient walked as evidence of power both human and divine. In death, the skull buried with its marks communicated to the community a lingering reminder of courage and intervention. Even millennia later, as archaeologists brush away earth and lift these skulls into light, the message remains. It is that humanity, even in its earliest eras, refused to sit passively under the burden of pain. People sought solutions, no matter how frightening. They risked the most vulnerable part of their anatomy to find relief, to save life, to appease spirit, or to open a pathway to meaning. That is the ultimate why. It is not reducible to one motive. It is reducible only to the essence of humanity itself, the drive not only to live, but to endure with defiance in the face of suffering, guided by courage, intuition, and an unbroken will to heal. And so, the story extends beyond the sterile record of surgery. It becomes a story of humanity's relationship with pain and mystery. People thousands of years ago, through a procedure both terrifying and miraculous, illuminated something we too often forget, that healing is never only about medicine. It is also about what people believe, what they hope, what they endure. In the silence of trepaned skulls lies the echo of those beliefs, and through them, we can glimpse the full richness of why the first healers dared to cut into the head. They did it because they had to, and because they could not imagine doing otherwise. The human spirit would not permit surrender where the possibility, however slim, of relief or salvation remained. The deeper we move into the story of ancient brain surgery, the more we find ourselves confronted by questions that reach far beyond archaeology and medicine. If Stone Age communities performed trepanation not only as ritual but also with demonstrable medical success, then we must seriously ask what this says about their knowledge of the human body. How did they come to understand, or at least to intuit, that the head was a place where intervention mattered? How much did they know about neurological function, about consciousness, about the cause and effect relationship between trauma to the skull and changes in thought, behavior, emotion, and survival? These questions linger powerfully because they compel us to acknowledge that intelligence, however it manifests, is not limited by writing systems or laboratories. It can and did emerge in other forms: observation, repetition, myth-making, a blending of curiosity and necessity. People of the Stone Age may have left us no written record of theories, no anatomical drawings, but the bone itself tells us they engaged with mysteries of the brain in ways we cannot dismiss. The simple presence of trepanned skulls points immediately toward awareness. They saw cause and effect. They made connections. When a person struck hard on the head suffered confusion or death, while another survived after surgical intervention, lessons were learned. From those lessons, patterns developed. But beyond the pragmatic recognition of physical trauma relief, there is a chilling possibility. They may have noticed that alterations in the brain could change personality, sensations, even spiritual perception. To live among the ill and injured is to observe transformations, and Stone Age communities lived closely with both. If a head injury could alter the spirit of a person, then the head was more than flesh and bone, it was a chamber of being. This recognition alone, even without scientific language, is profound knowledge. In modern neuroscience, we trace our deepest understanding of the brain to centuries of observation of injury. Language centers, motor centers, emotional changes, all were gradually discovered as clinicians correlated damage with deficits. Yet how different is this from the Stone Age healer, who must also have noticed that a patient struck in one way fell silent, another shook uncontrollably, another lost vision, another became irrational. Perhaps they could not map these functions, but they sensed something uncanny. The head controlled far more than physical survival. It became, by necessity, a locus of meaning. And having realized that, they dared to intervene there, suggesting an understanding simultaneously primitive and advanced, raw yet insightful. The mystery is magnified by the apparent refinement of techniques across generations. This refinement hints at a body of knowledge being transmitted, a primitive medical tradition, not entirely codified but living in oral instruction and ritual demonstration. We can imagine younger healers watching elders scrape the skull with flint, being told where to cut and where not to, how deeply to go, when to stop. These lessons, framed in stories of spirits perhaps, were also lessons rooted in empirical survival. This duality of spiritual teaching overlaying practical technique may have been the early shape of medical tradition. Were they aware they were beginning medicine? Almost certainly not. Yet the evidence suggests that fragments of practical knowledge were preserved, imitated, and improved, forming an unbroken chain that in some cultures lasted thousands of years. The most haunting question is whether they realized the brain itself was the center of consciousness. This is not easily answered. Many early civilizations that came much later placed the heart as the seat of the self. Egyptians famously cast aside the brain in mummification, preserving instead the heart as the throne of vitality. Yet the surgeons of the Stone Age, centuries earlier, were literally opening skulls and seeing within them the soft mass that governed life. Could they have intuited what later civilizations dismissed? Perhaps they did not articulate it as the brain is the source of the self, but they undeniably recognized that the head held the power to control life and spirit. At minimum, they must have known that relief could come from cutting here. Whether or not they saw the gray matter as thought itself, they approached it with solemn recognition of its significance. That they dared to place their tools there suggests reverence, fear, and knowledge all at once. Some researchers argue that such knowledge may have been partly inherited from the sheer trial of necessity. Across thousands of years, amid countless injuries, communities must have begun to see consistent outcomes. It is likely that knowledge of head trauma was widespread, known to warriors, to mothers, to hunters. When we consider this, it becomes less surprising that some group eventually tried to act upon it. Still, the boldness of acting on it is extraordinary. To see a child convulse, to suffer migraines, or to watch a brother fall unconscious after trauma that would have inspired terrifying helplessness. The healer who dared trepanation took a step both unthinkable and revolutionary. And if the patient lived, the community saw knowledge embodied. Knowledge in that sense was experimental, pragmatic, and undeniable. It spoke for itself in survival. But in assessing ancient knowledge, we must not imagine it was purely empirical. In fact, the more unsettling possibility is that it was framed holistically, combining what we would call medical observation with the mythic imagination of the cosmos. Knowledge of the head could not be separated from cosmological views. To them, the head may have been portal and battlefield, vessel and temple. Spirits entered, departed, possessed and protected through it. So when they cut, their justification was not only trauma relief, it was often to allow spirits to leave, to let light in, to free the soul. Yet even as they justified the act in spiritual terms, their hands were simultaneously achieving what modern medicine recognizes as genuine decompression of the brain. Thus, myth and medicine fused into one practice that exceeded either alone. They may have spoken of spirits, but their knives performed neurosurgery. This is the poignant paradox of Stone Age knowledge. The question, how did they know, echoes most loudly in this context. Did they know in any structured sense, or simply believe? The evidence insists on a subtler answer: both. Belief guided action, and action revealed outcome, which in turn reinforced belief. The process moved in circles, building knowledge without the scaffolding of theory but with the authority of lived experience. From this cycle came a kind of wisdom, difficult to categorize in modern terms but no less powerful. It was not science in the formal sense, but it was knowledge nonetheless, knowledge lived, not written, a library carried in scars instead of parchment. This recognition invites humility even today. Modern minds often assume progress is linear, that true knowledge belongs to us, while the past was fumbling in ignorance. But the bones break that narrative. The scars of ancient patients show that people were reasoning, experimenting, succeeding at tasks as perilous as brain surgery. They may not have known the names of nerves or lobes, but they knew survival when they saw it. They may not have defined consciousness, but they knew the head controlled destiny. They may not have mapped neural pathways, but they mapped survival into their community traditions. And in this lies the unsettling truth: they knew enough. Enough to save lives, enough to shape culture, enough to astonish us centuries later. There is a further dimension to their mysterious knowledge, the sense of experimentation. Some trepanations show partial openings, surface scrapings that do not penetrate into the cranial cavity. These may represent symbolic acts, but they may also represent practice-safe attempts, exploratory gestures, a healer learning the craft. In other words, these cultures allowed for trial, practice, the gradual mastery of technique. This is what modern science prizes most, the cycle of trial and error. That such a process could occur in the Stone Age without formal language or theory testifies to a form of intelligence as real as ours, though cloaked in other terms. If we consider the broader arc of history, this mystery grows sharper. Centuries later, societies with writing and architecture, with mathematics and complex religion, often ignored or dismissed the brain, placing the soul in the heart or stomach. What can we say about the Stone Age surgeons, who without writing cut into the very organ most advanced civilizations overlooked? Did they hold on to an intuition that others lost in the weight of tradition? Did they know something that knowledge itself later buried? Such tantalizing questions are impossible to answer fully, but they remind us that wisdom does not march in tidy sequences. It flickers in and out, sometimes brightest in unexpected places, preserved less in books than in scars and bones. One cannot help but wonder what conversations must have been held, what myths told after operations that succeeded. Did they claim that the evil spirit had truly escaped through the hole? Did they say that the gods had guided their hand? Did they whisper, perhaps without realizing, that the head was where life itself resided? And if so, was that not the first dawning recognition of the brain as the center of being? These questions hover, endless, poignant. For as we gaze upon the skulls, the answers will never be written. Yet the bone itself stands stubbornly as evidence that those people, at minimum, sensed mysteries of the head deeply enough to act. In exploring these questions, we look at them and recognize ourselves. For even today, much of what we do in medicine remains shadowed by mystery. We, too, act sometimes before we fully know, guided by probability, by observed outcomes, by integration of science with hope. Ancient healers acted the same, except their language was of spirits instead of molecules. The continuity is unmistakable. It humbles us, folding us back into the same human arc. They knew because they observed. They knew because they believed. They knew because they dared. And what they knew, though incomplete, was enough to etch permanent scars on bone and on history itself. Thus, the question of ancient medical knowledge is not answered by dismissing them as ignorant, nor by romanticizing them as hidden geniuses. It is answered by recognizing the spectrum of human knowledge: empirical, spiritual, intuitive, experimental. In their way, they combined all of these into one practice. And in doing so, they joined the long human struggle to understand the brain not with microscopes and maps, but with firelight, chance, and the willingness to face pain in search of relief. It was knowledge not of the textbook but of the body, of the spirit, of survival itself. And in that, it was knowledge that mattered most of all. What becomes striking when one surveys the global record of trepanation is not its rarity but its ubiquity. Excavations reveal altered skulls with deliberate openings not in one corner of the world or in a single epoch, but scattered from the Andes to the Alps, from the plains of Africa to the plateaus of Central Asia, from the islands of the Pacific to the frozen fields of Siberia. This widespread appearance is extraordinary. It forces us to confront the possibility that what might once have seemed a local experiment, or a strange cultural quirk, was in fact an instinct that arose again and again in disconnected human societies. The evidence is overwhelming: people separated by thousands of miles, linked by neither language nor trade, developed the same practice of cutting into the skull. The implications are not easily dismissed. Either knowledge traveled far more widely in the deep human past than we usually admit, or the impulse to open the head is so deeply rooted in human logic and imagination that it did not need to be transmitted. It arose, almost inevitably, wherever people faced injury, illness, and mystery. In the high Andes of South America, trepanation reached levels of sophistication that stunned modern researchers. Thousands of skulls unearthed in Peru and Bolivia carry evidence of surgical openings. Many of them reveal multiple attempts, some showing patients who survived repeated surgeries across years of life. The sizes and shapes of these openings varied, undergoing change across centuries. Early attempts seemed experimental, crude, and often lethal. Later ones show remarkable precision, clean edges, rapid healing. By the time of the Inca Empire, techniques had evolved so far that survival rates soared, surpassing even those of battlefield surgeons in the technologically advanced nations of Europe centuries later. The Andes reveal trepanation as not merely ritual but institutionalized practice, passed through generations, growing increasingly effective, and embedded as medicine in the fabric of society. This record alone demonstrates that Stone Age surgery was not an oddity, but a discipline. Contrast this with Europe, where trepanned skulls have been found in Neolithic burial sites stretching from France through the Balkans. Here too the evidence is centuries older than the Inca civilizations. In some cases, skulls show pseudo-trepanations, shallow scrapings that do not penetrate into the cranial cavity, suggesting symbolic acts of ritual rather than surgical necessity. In other cases, the openings are clean, fully penetrating, with signs of bone healing, suggesting authentic surgery. Even in the prehistoric caves of France, skulls with trepanations have been discovered dating as far back as 6500 BCE. These discoveries situate brain surgery as an early, pan-European reality. It is unsettling to realize that at the very roots of European prehistory, when agriculture was just emerging and communities were only beginning to build permanent settlements, people were already daring to open each other's skulls. That is as much a part of European origins as pottery or stone circles. In North Africa, trepan skulls have been found in ancient burial sites of Morocco, Libya, and Egypt. Some are older than written history itself. Again, there emerges the duality of motives. Openings performed on fractured skulls indicate practical medical attempts, while others suggest ritual purposes unexplained by trauma. As in Europe, many reveal signs of healing, confirming patient survival. What is most intriguing is that in later Egyptian civilization, despite advanced medicine in other areas, the practice of trepanation becomes rare. Some scholars infer that Egyptian ritual culture reoriented healing around other traditions, such as mummification and spiritual approaches to disease, leaving behind the surgical bravery of earlier ages. If so, then we are reminded again that human progress is not linear. Practices are gained and abandoned, knowledge remembered and forgotten, rediscovered in distant lands. In sub-Saharan Africa, the practice did not remain a fossil of the past but continued into relatively recent times. Ethnographic reports describe trepanation being performed within living memory in parts of East and Central Africa employing similar scraping methods, using iron tools or sharp blades, and often achieving survival. Here, anthropology confirms continuity, a direct line from the Stone Age through later ages into modern observation. In these accounts, the motives blend once more between medical needs, relief from pain, injury, or seizures, and cultural symbolism, associating the act with spiritual intervention or purification. These later survivals strengthen the case that trepanation was not a rare anomaly but a core element of human healing culture, resurfacing again and again where needed. In Asia, trepanation evidence surfaces across a broad geographic sweep. Skulls unearthed in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, dating back 2,000 years, show careful openings consistent with surgical technique. In Central Asia more broadly, archaeological finds confirm the presence of cranial openings with signs of survival. Even in China, where written medical tradition achieved remarkable sophistication, there are hints that similar operations may have been known, though incorporated differently into the vast framework of Chinese medicine. The reach into Asia demonstrates again that trepanation was not confined to a handful of cultures but distributed nearly globally, wherever human beings lived and faced the challenges of injury, mystery, and disease. The Pacific Islands also retain threads of this ancient tapestry. Accounts from travelers and anthropologists reveal that some Polynesian and Micronesian cultures continued forms of skull surgery into historical periods. In some cases, these procedures were framed overtly within shamanistic rituals. The continuity across oceans confirms that trepanation, whether independently discovered or transmitted, persisted across astonishing geographic distances. It is sobering to recognize that on islands scattered in the vastness of the Pacific, the same instinct to open the head appeared as in the mountains of Peru and the bogs of northern Europe. The global spread of trepanation poses one of the deepest enigmas of archaeology. Was there diffusion of knowledge, or universal intuition? Some argue that human contact, even in prehistory, may have transmitted ideas more widely than we suspect. After all, people migrated, traded, and crossed seas long before recorded history. Perhaps whispers of surgical practice traveled along with obsidian blades and shells. Others argue for independent emergence, that people everywhere faced head trauma and illness, and observing cause and effect, they stumbled independently upon similar solutions. Both possibilities astound. If the knowledge spread, then ancient interconnections were more profound than commonly acknowledged. If the knowledge arose independently, then the human mind itself carries a universal logic, leading people in vastly separate places to discover the same daring act. In either scenario, the story magnifies the sense of human unity. Across continents, without speaking the same language or sharing the same beliefs, people faced pain and refused to accept helplessness. They acted, and astonishingly, they acted in the same way. This provides a unique glimpse into the nature of human thought. Ideas fundamental enough to survival appear again and again, as though inscribed in our collective instinct. Fire was discovered in multiple places. Agriculture arose independently on different continents. And now we see that medical intervention by trepanation, too, arose spontaneously in scattered cultures. The impulse to control destiny, to cut into the most sacred part of the body in order to save life, is therefore global, cross-cultural, rooted in the very fabric of humanity. What deepens the fascination is the cultural variation within this shared framework. In the Andes, trepanation became systematic, refined to a near-medical science. In Europe, its presence was consistent but often blended with ritual. In Africa, it remained so trusted that it continued into modern periods. In Asia, it became embedded in broader healing cosmologies. In the Pacific, it fused seamlessly with shamanic traditions. Thus, the same act cutting the skull was clothed in countless meanings. It was medicine in one place, magic in another, both in yet another. The act itself was universal, but its symbolism was culturally sculpted. This is the paradox that makes trepanation such a powerful lens. It shows humanity united by instinct but diversified by imagination. For the modern listener, this global perspective is unsettling in its implications. We often assume the brain remained a mystery until modern anatomy revealed it millennia later. Yet across the world, people were already interacting directly with it, opening the skull, observing survival and death. They may have lacked the language to their eyes but they gained practical knowledge through action. This universality hints that awareness of the brain's significance was more profound across early humanity than we allow ourselves to believe. Perhaps the brain was more obviously linked to spirit and behavior in the everyday lives of people who observed injury closely. Perhaps the sense of the head as a gateway to both life and otherworld was unavoidable, and trepanation the inevitable response. It is worth pausing here to meditate on what this reveals about the unity of humankind. When a practice appears across every continent, not as accident but as intentional craft, it binds together the entire human species across time and space. It tells us that the challenges of pain, trauma, and mystery were universal, and the solutions we arrived at were resonant as well. We share not only DNA, not only instincts for food and shelter, but also the courage to perform daring interventions when life seemed at stake. Trepanation, then, is more than a medical or ritual act. It is a symbol of our shared humanity, an emblem of our collective refusal to remain powerless in the face of suffering. To gaze at trepan skulls from different corners of the globe is to see a mirror of oneself, of one's ancestors, of the same desperate courage that animates us still. This realization casts ancient brain surgery not as bizarre deviation but as common heritage. And it demands that we expand our conception of early knowledge. It was not localized genius but a global instinct. The Stone Age healers of the Andes, the Neolithic surgeons of France, the shamans of Africa, the ritualists of Siberia all participated in the same great experiment, to open the human head. And though their languages, myths, and environments differed, their acts converge across time to form an astonishing chorus of human audacity. The haunting question remains, was this interconnected echo of humanity a matter of deep communication or parallel discovery? We may never know. But the bones themselves whisper a phrase we cannot ignore: you are more alike than you imagine. Wherever humans dwelt, they observed suffering and answered it similarly. Across continents, they carried the same flame of curiosity, desperation, resilience that would one day ignite the fires of modern science. And when we contemplate this global symphony of trepanation, we hear not only the scraping of stone against bone, but the first chords of humanity's unified quest to preserve life by daring, by belief, by knowledge half seen but wholly felt. As we return to the present, hearing this ancient chorus, it reshapes our sense of belonging. It reminds us that beneath the surface differences of culture, humanity's response to suffering has always been astonishingly the same. We cut, we healed, we risked, and we survived. Thus, trepanation across the world is not an archaic curiosity but an enduring proof that from the beginning, we were one species sharing one impulse, to resist death, to confront mystery, to open the door of the skull not with recklessness but with willful hope. And in every land, that hope has left its mark in bone, waiting patiently for us to uncover it and remember who we truly are. As the trail of trepanation stretches across continents and centuries, we begin to see how its echoes reverberated into later civilizations and, astonishingly, into the roots of medicine as we know it today. The skulls of the Neolithic whisper directly into the ears of later physicians, not through writing or formal manuals but through continuity of practice, through remembered acts passed down orally and ritually until they shaped the foundations of what would eventually become clinical tradition. In following the fate of trepanation from the Stone Age to the ancient and classical worlds, the story of brain surgery becomes the story of medicine itself, the gradual turning of ritual into observation, and observation into empiricism, until finally, with many stumblings, it metamorphosed into what we try to call science. Yet the paradox remains that at times, Stone Age healers with stone tools achieved survival outcomes superior to the sterile halls of later scholarly hospitals. Their legacy is not only historical, but profoundly humbling. When ancient medicine emerged in the cradles of civilization in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, echoes of trepanation were already present, though adapted into new systems of meaning. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets record attempts to understand head injury and its link to altered consciousness. While the surgeons here did not always explicitly mention cutting into the skull, there is a sense of inherited memory, the awareness that head trauma could be intervened upon. Some historians believe that the practice of trepanation, well attested in pre-Mesopotamian times in northern and eastern regions, filtered into the background of Mesopotamian medicine. If so, the refinements of later Near Eastern physicians rest upon the unrecorded successes of Neolithic shamans whose names are long lost. Egypt presented another layer of paradox. In the prehistoric burials of North Africa, many trepan skulls had been discovered, just as in Europe and South America. Yet when Egyptian civilization bloomed, with its elaborate embalming practices and medical hierarchies, trepanation seems to dwindle. Priests of medicine focused their attention upon the heart as the seat of life, discarding the brain entirely during mummification rituals. And yet fragments of continuity remain. Certain skulls from Old Kingdom contexts hint at scraping similar to trepanation, perhaps in specialized cases of injury. Could it be that small echoes of Stone Age knowledge survived even in the heart of a culture that officially denied the importance of the brain? The presence of such fragments suggests that although cultural theory turned elsewhere, the practical instinct of trepanation never completely disappeared. Greece furnishes us with one of the clearest bridges between the ancient and the modern. The corpus attributed to Hippocrates contains passages that explicitly recommend trepanation as treatment for skull fractures. Here the practice is clearly documented. Physicians were taught which head injuries required openings, how to place the hole in relation to the fracture, and how to avoid complications. That trepanation frames part of the Hippocratic tradition is astonishing. It means that what began as Stone Age daring by torchlight became, gradually, a codified procedure inside one of the world's first formal systems of medicine. In this continuity lies one of humanity's most remarkable transitions. At Hippocrates' hand, the operation inherited from unnamed ancestors gained legitimacy and instruction, transforming from oral guidance into written canon. The circle of bone did not vanish under the weight of philosophy and mathematics, it persisted as practical survival knowledge, carried forward until it became permanent in medical law. The Romans, inheriting much of Greek medicine, continued the use of trepanation in surgical contexts. Roman battlefield medics, faced with fractured skulls from sword strikes, relied upon cranial openings to relieve pressure and remove bone fragments. Manuals of Roman military medicine explicitly describe the trepan, the tool itself named after the operation, as essential in practice. Here, the lineage continues, from Stone Age flint scraper, to Hippocratic reflection, to steel Roman trepan. The concept persists, adapted and retooled across time. Each tool is different, but the act remains the same. Each culture explains the act differently, but survival ensures it did not vanish. Later, in the Middle Ages, the practice lingered within both folk and professional traditions. Surgeons, limited by the lack of antibiotics, still revived classical recommendations. Across Europe during medieval centuries, trepanation was used as response to seizures and insanity as often as to injury. Here again we see the duality of medicine and magic fused. The healer drilled into the skull both to release spirits and to release blood, sometimes in the same breath, simultaneously ritual and pragmatic. Success remained mixed, but enough survived to reinforce the practice until scientific medicine began to reform. We must not reduce this continuity to Europe alone. In the Islamic Golden Age, classical texts survived and were translated, including detailed instructions on cranial surgery. Arabic physicians debated proper circumstances for trepanation and developed improved instruments, thereby ensuring that the lineage of head surgery, preserved from Greece, remained alive. In India, too, texts like the Sushruta Samhita describe surgical approaches to injury that echo some of the logic behind trepanation, perhaps independent, perhaps inherited through currents of knowledge that flowed invisibly across trade networks. Knowledge, threaded and refracted, seems never to have been entirely lost, even if it slept centuries at a time before waking again in another place, another tongue. These echoes remind us that the Stone Age did not vanish in prehistory. It extended its influence like a subterranean river across civilizations, sometimes breaking through unexpectedly, pushing shoots into eras that considered themselves more advanced. Each shoot was trepanation, resurfacing, reminding the world that daring hands had pressed against skulls long before. There is also the sobering recognition that later medicine sometimes fared worse. Mortality in European hospitals for cranial operations far exceeded that of Inca healers or African shamans using stone blades. How could this be? The answer, curiously, lies in complexity. Metal instruments reused among countless patients spread infection invisibly. Closed, crowded hospitals bred bacteria that overwhelmed wounded men. Stone Age surgeons, unknowingly, benefited from fresh stone edges, outdoor air, herbal compresses with antibacterial properties. Thus, later knowledge was hampered by ignorance at another level, the level of microorganisms. The lesson crystallizes painfully: wisdom is never total, and progress is not linear. Some things were known, then lost. Some risks were avoided only by accident. In comparing the Stone Age with the Enlightenment, it is hideously ironic that the so-called primitive often preserved life more reliably. When antiseptic methods finally emerged in the 19th century, trepanation transformed once again, shedding its ritual skin to become neurosurgery proper. Surgeons like Joseph Lister revolutionized sanitation. Anesthesia reduced the agony that ancient patients endured awake. Precision instruments replaced flint and bone. In this new age, the direct lineage of trepanning through skull persisted, now justified by modern science. Yet even here, when textbooks speak of cranial drilling or decompression, the shadows of the past remain. Every surgical burr and saw is but an echo of the obsidian blade that first scraped millennia ago. The continuity is undeniable. It is powerful to pause and contemplate this chain: a Neolithic healer breaking through bone, an Inca artisan scraping a window into the skull, a Hippocratic physician recommending trepan, a Roman medic carrying steel drills into battle, a medieval monk praying as he cuts, a 19th-century surgeon washing his hands before the act, and a modern neurosurgeon standing over an unconscious patient under sterile light. They are all the same in essence, the same gesture, the same hope, the same audacity to pierce the head in defiance of suffering and death. Time divides them, culture reframes them, tools transform, but the continuity of spirit spans thousands of years. This recognition condenses into a profound lesson about medicine at large. The pursuit of healing is not one of neat ascents but of spirals, circles, recurrences. Knowledge is not always remembered, an error is not always eliminated. But the will to attempt what seems impossible remains constant. In every age, trepanation reappears in form suited to its era, and in every age it speaks of courage, desperation, and community bonds. As such, trepanation is not merely the root of brain surgery, it is the root symbol of all medicine, the willingness to place one's hands into danger for another's survival. Hence, when scholars call trepanation the oldest known surgical procedure, it is not hyperbole. It is literal, and it is symbolic. It anchors the beginning of the medical profession itself. Standing over another, risking their life to preserve it, the Stone Age surgeon becomes the archetype of healer in all time. And when his descendants hold scalpels today, they still enact the same contract: to intervene in mystery, to risk, to hope, and to save. Therefore, trepanation's survival into Greek and Roman medicine, its presence in medieval texts, its continuation through folk traditions, and its assimilation into scientific neurosurgery, these are not separate stories but one continuous strand. A strand that proves human beings have always possessed not only the imagination to dream myths and gods, but the will to act materially upon the body, to test reality and reshape it by cutting, healing, surviving. The skulls discovered across the earth are the earliest libraries of this will. Every hospital today is built knowingly or not upon their foundation. With that realization, the mystery transforms from passive curiosity into active meaning. The Stone Age taught us that the brain could be reached. Later civilizations enshrined that knowledge into text. Science finally reframed it with precision. But the heart of it remains unchanged, the belief that beneath suffering lies the possibility of relief, and someone must be willing to take the risk to reach it. In the circle cut into ancient skulls lies the circle of medicine itself, endlessly repeating, endlessly renewed, endlessly connecting us with those who first dared to carve bone and glimpse, however faintly, the fragile sanctuary of the human mind. Across the long journey we have taken together through whispers of bone and echoes of forgotten voices, we finally arrive at the closing reflection of this mystery, a reflection that is less about the technicalities of Stone Age surgeries and more about the meaning hidden inside them. For the further we explore trepanation, the deeper it draws us not simply into the history of medicine but into the heart of humanity itself. The skulls, with their ancient scars, stand before us not only as archaeological artifacts but as philosophical mirrors. They force us to consider what it means to be human, what it means to confront pain, what it means to resist helplessness even in the shadow of overwhelming ignorance. If these people, living in the deep prehistory of our species, dared to experiment upon the most fragile and sacred part of the body, then what does this say about the relentless impulse woven into our nature, the refusal to surrender, the hunger to heal, the curiosity to open even the sealed chamber of the brain in search of hope? The journey began with astonishment. When early archaeologists first unearthed skulls bearing precise, deliberate holes, disbelief mingled with awe. Could it be true that thousands of years ago, long before writing, cities, or metal tools, people were already cutting into one another's skulls? And when the evidence of healing at the edges of the bone became impossible to deny, or deepened into humility, these were not accidents of violence. They were procedures. They were, in every meaningful sense, surgery. And they were sometimes successful. It is in that word, success, that the heart of the enigma lies. Without success, these operations would have disappeared. Without survival, the practice would not have persisted from Europe to South America, from Africa to Asia. Survival is the skeleton key of the mystery, and survival forces us to see the courage, intuition, and refined skills that lived in people we still too often dismiss as primitive. We journeyed then into the world of tools and techniques. Stone, when fractured, gave edges sharper than steel. Obsidian in particular could cut with a precision that rivals modern surgical blades. Scraping, drilling, boring, these were not haphazard slashes but systematic approaches, chosen, repeated, refined. And above all, patience was evident, bone removed in layers, bleeding controlled carefully, wounds treated with herbal compresses, heads bandaged, communities assembled in tense ritual as the healer worked. The skulls preserve not only surgery but the memory of method. That methods varied across continents proves not ignorance but adaptation. Everywhere, people met the same problem and crafted their own solution. Then we followed these skulls across time and space. The Andes yielded thousands of trepanned heads, their survival rates impressing even modern surgeons. The bogs of northern Europe preserved faces that still seemed to sleep, skulls drilled carefully by hands long vanished. Africa presented continuity into modern times, demonstrating that the craft lived not only in prehistory but endured deep into human memory. Asia contributed its own variations, Siberian skulls offering testimony of surgeries carried out near the roof of the world. Polynesia carried the practice into the Pacific, showing yet again that distance meant nothing when confronted with injury and the universal urge to heal. The practice was global. It may have been shared, or it may have been rediscovered endlessly, but in both cases it was universal, so deeply human that it seems as if the idea itself was born from the very structure of our minds. But the question has always been most piercing: why? Why would anyone, long before anesthesia or antiseptics, decide to open a skull? The answers, as we saw, are layered. Sometimes it was necessity, a warrior struck, a hunter bleeding, the healer aware relief meant opening bone. Sometimes it was ritual, seizures seen as possession, headaches named as curses, trepanation acting as the doorway for spirits to leave or for balance to be restored. Sometimes, astonishingly, it may have been visionary, a connection to altered state sought by cutting a hole in the skull, in pursuit not of healing but of communion with the divine. Perhaps most often, it was everything at once: medicine and myth, healing and ritual, body and spirit, all merging in one monumental gesture. And in that merger lies the truth of Stone Age thought, that knowledge was holistic, not divided, that the healer was priest and surgeon, the operation both science and ceremony. As centuries progressed, Trepanation's legacy lived on. Hippocrates described it. Roman medics carried it into battle. Medieval healers, still invoking spirits, drilled into skulls in monasteries and villages alike. Islamic medicine preserved the knowledge, giving it instruments and definitions. And modern neurosurgery, with antiseptic care and electric drills, continues the same essential practice in emergency decompressions. Thus the line from the Stone Age healer to the operating theatre is unbroken. The tools have changed, the context shifted, but the act itself, the decision to risk entry into the skull for the sake of saving life, is ever the same. And what, at last, does this mean for us? It means we must reconsider the story we tell ourselves about humanity. We are not a species that stumbled forward blindly until reason suddenly emerged. We are instead a species that carried within it all along a deep and dangerous courage, a willingness to experiment, a compassion that drove healers to act even in terror, and a curiosity that could not rest in ignorance. The skulls of Trepan patients are monuments not to savagery but to the nobility of daring. They are memorials to a truth hidden beneath the noise of history, that humans, everywhere, are bound more by their refusals than by their resignations. They refuse to give up the sick. They refuse to surrender to superstition alone. They refuse to believe suffering was unalterable. So they cut. So they tried. So they sometimes succeeded. The final reflection returns us to the haunting question with which we began: how did they know? Perhaps they did not know in terms we would use today. They did not know bacteria, or antisepsis, or neuroanatomy. But they knew survival. They knew observation. They knew trial and result. And above all, they knew the human compulsion never to rest while another lay in pain. That is enough. In some ways it is more than enough, for it is the very bedrock upon which we built everything that we now take for granted in medicine. The healers of the Stone Age did not need to know the brain as we do. They needed only to believe that action was possible, and in that belief, they created the first echoes of the science we live within today. So when you close your eyes tonight, drifting on the tide of a documentary meant to guide you into calm, remember this: behind the quiet narration, behind the dim images of flickering torches in caves, behind the sharp edge of obsidian scraping against bone, lies a truth about our species that is at once terrible and beautiful. We have always been willing to risk the impossible. We have always carried within us the ability to blend fear with courage, ignorance with discovery, ritual with survival. The Trepan skulls, sleeping beneath the earth for thousands of years, rise now in our imagination not to frighten us but to reassure us. They remind us that even in the depths of darkness, humans reached toward light. Even without books, humans sought knowledge. Even without steel, humans shaped blades sharp enough to cut pain away. They remind us that hope is older than history itself. And so, our long journey together through this enigma comes to its end. We began in mystery, walked through silence and scars, traveled across continents, and traced the lineage into modern neurosurgery. Along the way, we discovered that to be human is to dare, to heal, and sometimes, miraculously, to succeed. Trepanation, that oldest of surgeries, is nothing less than a mirror of who we have always been. Thank you, dear listeners, for allowing me to guide you through this story tonight. As you drift into rest, may the courage of our ancestors remind you of resilience, may their daring remind you of hope, and may the calm echo of their survival carry you gently into sleep. Good night, and may the mysteries of the past watch kindly over your dreams.